Millionaire sees his maid picking food from the trash. When he discovers the reason, he breaks down crying. High on a hill, dominating the city skyline, stood the majestic mansion of Alexander Morgan. With its marble columns and windows that sparkled like diamonds in the sunlight, the property was a testament to success and opulence. Alexander, at 45, was the very image of business triumph. His technology company, Tech Vision, had revolutionized the industry with innovations that seemed straight out of science fiction movies. That morning, Alexander woke to the soft rustle of Egyptian silk sheets. He stretched lazily, enjoying the luxury that surrounded him. His morning routine was a well-rehearsed ritual, a bath in his jacuzzi with panoramic views of the city, followed by a gourmet breakfast prepared by his personal chef. As he savored his imported coffee, Alexander browsed the latest news on his state-of-the-art tablet. The headlines spoke of his most recent achievement. Tech Vision had launched an artificial intelligence system that promised to revolutionize healthcare. The company's stocks had soared, adding hundreds of millions more to Alexander's already considerable fortune. "Mr. Morgan, your car is ready," announced James, his butler, interrupting his thoughts. Alexander nodded, adjusted his silk tie in front of the mirror, and left the mansion. His Rolls-Royce waited, gleaming in the morning sun. As the chauffeur opened the door for him, Alexander couldn't help but feel a wave of satisfaction. Everything in his life was perfect, orderly, just as he had planned it. The journey to Tech Vision's headquarters was smooth and silent. Alexander took the opportunity to review his day's agenda: meetings with investors, a video conference with his development team in Tokyo, and planning for his next marketing campaign. His mind was already racing, anticipating the challenges and opportunities that awaited him. Upon arrival at the imposing glass and steel building that housed Tech Vision, Alexander was greeted with bows and smiles. Employees and executives alike parted at his approach, murmuring respectful greetings. He responded with polite but distant gestures, always maintaining that aura of inaccessibility that he believed was a fundamental part of his leadership image. In his top-floor office, with panoramic views of the city, Alexander immersed himself in his work. The hours flew by between calls, presentations, and decisions that would affect the future of thousands of employees and millions of users of his products. By the time the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Alexander felt that familiar sense of accomplishment. Another productive day, another step closer to the top of the business world. As he gathered his things to return home, his assistant rushed in. "Mr. Morgan, there's a problem in the parking lot. It seems one of the maintenance employees is causing a scene." Alexander frowned. He hated problems, especially those that threatened to tarnish the perfect image of his company. "What's it about?" he asked, his voice tinged with irritation. It's better if you see for yourself, sir," replied the assistant, visibly uncomfortable. Intrigued and annoyed in equal measure, Alexander followed his assistant to the underground parking lot. What he saw there left him paralyzed. Next to the dumpsters, illuminated by the cold fluorescent lights, was a middle-aged man dressed in Tech Vision's maintenance uniform. The man, with frantic and desperate movements, was rummaging through the trash bags, pulling out food scraps and putting them in a plastic bag he carried. Alexander felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. The scene was so surreal, so out of place in the neat and orderly world he had built, that for a moment he didn't know how to react. Who is that man?" he finally managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. "It's Mark Rodriguez, sir. He's been working in maintenance for almost 10 years, replied the assistant, avoiding looking directly at the scene. Alexander observed Mark, noticing for the first time the details, the deep eye bags, the calloused hands, the way his shoulders hunched under an invisible weight. How was it possible that someone who worked for him in his successful and prosperous company was reduced to searching for food in the trash? At that moment, Mark looked up and his eyes met Alexander's. For an instant, time seemed to stand still. In Mark's gaze, Alexander saw a mixture of shame, desperation, and a glimmer of something else, resentment, resignation. As quickly as it had happened, the moment passed. Mark, realizing he had been discovered, hurriedly gathered his bag and walked away almost running, disappearing into the shadows of the parking lot. Alexander stood there, motionless, feeling as if the ground beneath his feet had begun to shake. The image of Mark searching through the trash had been etched into his mind, challenging everything he thought he knew about his company, his success, his world. "Mr. Morgan, do you want me to call security?" asked the assistant, breaking the silence. Alexander shook his head, unable to find words. Without saying anything more, he turned and headed to his car, his mind a whirlwind of unanswered questions. As the Rolls-Royce glided through the city's night streets, Alexander looked out the window, but no longer saw the illuminated skyscrapers or luxurious storefronts. Instead, he saw Mark's face, again and again, like a persistent reminder of a reality he had chosen to ignore for too long. For the first time in years, Alexander Morgan, the technology magnate, the man who had everything, felt deeply disturbed. And as the mansion appeared on the horizon, a question echoed in his mind. What else had he been overlooking? The sound of persistent coughing woke Mark Rodriguez long before his alarm clock went off. He sat up slowly in bed, rubbing his tired eyes as he listened intently. The cough was coming from the adjacent room, where his mother, Mrs. Sarah, slept, or at least tried to sleep. Mark looked at the clock, 4:30 a.m. With a sigh, he got up and headed to his mother's small room. He found her sitting up in bed, her fragile body shaken by another coughing fit. "Mom, how are you feeling?" asked Mark, sitting beside her and gently rubbing her back. Mrs. Sarah tried to smile between coughs. "I'm fine, son. Don't worry about me. Go back to sleep. You have to work." But Mark knew she wasn't fine. His mother's lung disease had worsened in recent months, and the medications were becoming increasingly expensive. He looked around the small room, noticing the cracks in the walls, the peeling paint, the old fan that barely worked. This was not the place where his mother should be spending her final years. After making sure Mrs. Sarah took her medications and went back to sleep, Mark returned to his room. But sleep had already abandoned him. He sat on the edge of the bed, his mind a whirlwind of worries. The sound of light footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. His older daughter, Lucy, 10 years old, appeared at the door, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Dad, is Grandma sick again?" she asked in a worried voice. Mark forced a smile. "Don't worry, sweetheart. Grandma just needs to rest. Go back to bed. It's still very early." Lucy nodded, but instead of returning to her room, she approached and hugged her father. Mark held her close, feeling a lump in his throat. How could he explain to his daughter that things would get better when he wasn't even sure of it himself? When Lucy finally went back to her bed, Mark got up and began to prepare for another long day of work. In the kitchen, while preparing a simple breakfast, his gaze fell on the nearly empty refrigerator. His stomach churned as he remembered what he had had to do the night before in TechVision's parking lot. Shame and guilt invaded him again, but he pushed them aside with determination. He would do whatever was necessary to feed his family. At 6 sharp, Mark left his small apartment in a modest neighborhood of the city. The contrast with the world he was heading to couldn't be more stark. As he walked to the bus stop, he saw his neighbors starting their day, construction workers loading their tools, mothers taking their children to school before going to their own jobs, elderly people sweeping the sidewalks in front of their homes. The bus ride was long and cramped, but Mark barely noticed. His mind was busy making calculations, trying to stretch his salary to cover all the needs. Rent, food, his mother's medications, the children's school supplies. No matter how he tried, the numbers never added up. When he arrived at the imposing gates of TechVision, Mark felt the familiar knot in his stomach. He entered through the service door, greeting his maintenance colleagues with a gesture. They all wore the same grey uniform, becoming almost invisible in the company's gleaming hallways. As the day progressed, Mark moved through the company floors like a ghost, cleaning, repairing, making sure everything worked perfectly for the brilliant engineers and executives who didn't even notice his presence. Every time he passed near the cafeteria, the smell of fresh food made his stomach growl, reminding him of the scarcity at home. During his break, Mark sat in a secluded corner of the maintenance area, taking out the small lunch he had prepared, a simple sandwich and a slightly bruised apple. As he ate, he couldn't help thinking about the scene from the night before. Shame invaded him again as he remembered the look of shock on Mr. Morgan's face. "Are you okay, Mark?" asked Rose, one of his colleagues, sitting next to him. Mark forced a smile. "Yeah, just a bit tired. My mother hasn't been well." Rose nodded understandingly. "If you need anything, you know you can count on me." Mark appreciated the gesture, but he knew Rose had her own struggles. They all did here. The rest of the day passed in a haze of repetitive tasks and constant worries. When it was finally time to leave, Mark felt exhausted, physically and emotionally. But his day was far from over. On the way home, he stopped at a pharmacy to buy his mother's medications. The price had gone up again, and Mark felt a weight in his chest as he saw how little was left in his wallet after paying. Upon reaching his building, he climbed the stairs slowly, each step an effort. Before entering his apartment, he paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and put on his best smile. He didn't want his children to see his worry. "Dad!" shouted Lucy and her younger brother, Michael, 7 years old, running to hug him as soon as he entered. "My loves," responded Mark, hugging them tightly. For a moment, all his worries vanished. The night passed in a familiar routine, helping the children with their homework, preparing a simple dinner, making sure his mother took her medications. While washing the dishes, Mark listened to Lucy reading a story to Michael, and the sound of their laughter was like a balm for his tired soul. Later, after putting the children to bed, Mark sat on the small balcony of the apartment, looking at the city lights. In the distance, he could see the Tech Vision building shining like a beacon of wealth and success. The image of Mr. Morgan came back to his mind, and with it, a mix of emotions, shame, resentment, and a hint of hope he couldn't explain. Mark took out a small silver necklace from his pocket, the only thing of value he had left. It had belonged to his late wife, Emily, and was the last thing he had of her. He caressed the pendant nostalgically, remembering better times. What would Emily think of his current situation? Would she be disappointed? With a sigh, he put the necklace away again. He couldn't sell it, not yet. It was the last vestige of a life that seemed increasingly distant. As he prepared for bed, Mark promised himself that he would find a way to move forward, for his children, for his mother, for Emily's memory. No matter what he had to do, he wouldn't give up. Alexander Morgan couldn't sleep that night. The image of Mark searching through the trash haunted him every time he closed his eyes. He got up before dawn, restless and disturbed. As he watched the sun rise from the balcony of his master suite, Alexander realized that something fundamental had changed in him. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, he felt truly uncomfortable in his own skin. "How is this possible?" he wondered aloud. "How can someone who works for me be reduced to searching for food in the trash?" The question echoed in his mind, challenging everything he thought he knew about his company, his success, his worldview. Determined to understand, Alexander did something he had never done before. He personally called human resources. "I need all the information you have on Mark Rodriguez from the maintenance department," he ordered, his voice betraying an unusual urgency. While waiting for the information, Alexander walked through his mansion with new eyes. Every luxury item, every comfort, now seemed to scream at him about the disparity between his life and that of people like Mark. When he finally received Mark's file, Alexander immersed himself in reading it. He discovered that Mark had been working at Tech Vision for almost a decade, always punctual, always efficient. He had 2 children and a sick mother in his care. His salary, although within market standards for his position, barely covered the basic needs of a family in the city. "How did I not realize this before?" muttered Alexander, feeling a mixture of guilt and frustration. Driven by an urgent need to do something, Alexander made an impulsive decision. He dressed in simple clothes, something he would never normally wear, and headed to the neighborhood where Mark lived. The contrast with his own neighborhood was shocking. Deteriorated buildings, narrow streets, children playing on cracked sidewalks. Alexander felt like a stranger in his own city. He found Mark's building and, after hesitating for a moment, entered. He climbed the stairs, noticing the smell of dampness, the peeling walls, the sounds of lives crammed into small spaces. In front of Mark's door, Alexander hesitated again. What was he really doing? What did he hope to achieve? Before he could decide, the door opened. "Mr. Morgan?" Mark's surprised voice snapped him out of his thoughts. Alexander found himself face to face with the man he had seen in the parking lot, but in a completely different context. Mark seemed smaller here, more vulnerable, with deep eye bags and an expression of confusion and alarm. "Mark, I came to talk to you," said Alexander, surprised by the insecurity in his own voice. Mark, visibly uncomfortable, looked both ways down the hallway before inviting Alexander in. The interior of the apartment was small but clean, with worn but well cared for furniture. From a nearby room, the sound of persistent coughing could be heard. "My mother," explained Mark, noticing Alexander's look. "She's sick." Alexander nodded, feeling increasingly out of place. What right did he have to invade Mark's private life like this? "Mark, about what I saw last night," Alexander began, but stopped when he saw the expression of shame and fear on Mark's face. "Mr. Morgan, please, don't fire me," begged Mark, his voice barely a whisper. "I need this job. My family depends on me." The plea hit Alexander like a punch to the stomach. How had it come to this? How could a hard-working man fear so much for his livelihood? "I'm not here to fire you, Mark," said Alexander, trying to maintain his composure. "I'm here because I want to understand. I want to know how I can help." The surprise on Mark's face was evident. For a moment, both men looked at each other, not knowing what to say. The silence was broken by the sound of the door opening. "Dad, I forgot my math book." A girl's cheerful voice cut off abruptly upon seeing the stranger in their living room. "Lucy, honey, this is Mr. Morgan, my boss," explained Mark, the discomfort evident in his voice. Lucy looked at Alexander with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Are you the owner of the company where my dad works?" she asked directly. Alexander nodded, surprised by the girl's frankness. "That's right." "Then can you give my dad a raise?" Lucy continued, ignoring Mark's warning look. "He works very hard, you know, and we need money for Grandma's medicines." "Lucy," intervened Mark, mortified. "Go to school. We'll talk later." The girl left reluctantly, but not before casting a final inquisitive look at Alexander. The silence that followed was dense, loaded with unexpressed emotions and uncomfortable realities. Alexander looked around, noticing for the first time the details, the family photos on the walls, the worn toys in a corner, a table with school books and unpaid bills. "Mark," Alexander began, his voice softer than it had ever been in a business conversation, "I want you to know that what I saw last night, it made me realize that I've been blind to many things. I want to help, not just you, but all Tech Vision employees who might be going through similar situations." Mark looked at him with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "Mr. Morgan, I appreciate your concern, but why now? Why me?" The question hit Alexander hard. Why now? Why had he needed to see something so extreme to realize the reality of his employees? "Because I've been living in a bubble, Mark," admitted Alexander, surprised by his own honesty. "And it's time for that to change." At that moment, a metallic glint caught Alexander's attention. Mark was wearing a necklace, a simple silver pendant hanging from his neck. For some reason, that necklace seemed strangely familiar to Alexander, but he couldn't place why. "That necklace," Alexander began, but was interrupted by another cough coming from the adjacent room. "I need to attend to my mother," said Mark, clearly anxious to end this uncomfortable visit. Alexander nodded, understanding. "Of course." "Mark, I promise you this won't end here. There will be changes at Tech Vision, real changes that will benefit all employees." As he left the apartment, Alexander felt a mix of emotions, guilt, determination, and a strange feeling that there was more to this situation, something he couldn't quite identify yet. Back in his luxury car, Alexander took one last look at Mark's building. The disparity between this world and his own was overwhelming, but now that he had seen the reality, he couldn't ignore it. "Let's go to the office," he ordered his driver. "We have a lot of work to do." As the car drove away, Alexander couldn't get the image of Mark's necklace out of his mind. Why did it seem so familiar? And what other unexpected secrets and connections would he discover on this journey of rediscovery? Alexander spent the next few days immersed in a whirlwind of activity: meetings with the Human Resources Department, consultations with corporate social responsibility experts, thorough reviews of TechVision's salary and benefits policies. Each new piece of information he obtained only deepened his sense of guilt and his determination to make real changes. However, in the midst of all this flurry of activity, Alexander couldn't get the image of Mark's necklace out of his mind. That sense of familiarity haunted him like a memory on the tip of his tongue that refused to fully materialize. One night, while reviewing old photo albums in search of inspiration for the new wellness programs he planned to implement in the company, Alexander came across an image that left him breathless. It was a photo from his teenage years, him with his first love, Sophie, and there, hanging from Sophie's neck, was a necklace identical to the one he had seen on Mark. "It can't be," Alexander muttered, bringing the photo closer to examine it better. Memories began to flood his mind. Sophie had been his girlfriend in his senior year of high school, his first true love. She came from a modest but loving family, and she had been the one who first opened his eyes to realities different from his own. The necklace had been a gift from Alexander, bought with his savings, a promise of eternal love. But then, life had separated them. Alexander had left to study abroad, promising to stay in touch. However, immersed in his new life, in his ambition to succeed, he had gradually let the communication fade. When he returned, years later, Sophie had disappeared. No one knew what had become of her. How did that necklace end up with Mark? Alexander wondered, his mind working at full speed. Could there be some connection between Sophie and Mark, or was it all a cruel coincidence of fate? Determined to get to the bottom of this mystery, Alexander did something he hadn't done in years. He looked up the number of his old high school friend, Ray, who had been Sophie's best friend. "Alexander, is that you?" Ray's surprised voice resonated through the phone. "It's been so long." After briefly exchanging some pleasantries, Alexander got straight to the point. "Ray, I need to ask you something about Sophie. Did you hear anything about her after I left?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Ray spoke again, his voice was laden with emotion. "Alexander, there's something you should know. Something I promised not to say, but I think it's time you knew." Alexander's heart began to beat rapidly. "What is it, Ray?" "A boy. Sophie's family raised him." Alexander collapsed into his chair, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. "The boy, what became of him?" "The last I heard, his name was Mark Rodriguez, like Sophie's maiden name." Alexander's world stopped. Mark, his employee, the man he had seen searching through the trash, the man whose poverty had shaken him to his core. Could he be his son? "Ray, I need you to tell me everything you know," said Alexander, his voice barely a whisper. As Ray told him everything he knew about Sophie's fate and her son, Alexander felt his entire life being rewritten. Every decision he had made, every step on his path to success, now was seen in a new light. That night, Alexander didn't sleep. He stayed awake, looking at old photos of Sophie, trying to see Mark's features in them. How had he not noticed before? How many times had he passed by his own son without knowing it? The next morning, with deep eye bags and a heavy heart, Alexander made a decision. He needed to talk to Mark, reveal the truth, try to make amends for years of involuntary absence. But how do you tell someone who has been your distant boss for years that you're actually their father? How do you repair a lifetime of absence and neglect? Alexander spent the next few days in a state of constant agitation. On one hand, he was implementing radical changes at TechVision, salary increases, better benefits, wellness programs for employees. On the other, he struggled with the truth he had just discovered and the best way to reveal it. Finally, after a week of internal debate, Alexander decided he needed to talk to Mark again. This time, however, the conversation would carry much more weight. Mark was surprised when he received the call from Mr. Morgan's office, requesting another meeting. The last few days had been a whirlwind of changes at Tech Vision, unexpected salary increases, new benefits, even the promise of a scholarship program for employees' children. Everyone in the company was talking about Mr. Morgan's sudden transformation. When Mark entered Alexander's office, he immediately noticed that something was different. The normally impeccable businessman looked tired, with visible eye bags and an expression of deep concern on his face. "Mark, please, sit down," said Alexander, his voice laden with an emotion that Mark couldn't identify. Mark sat down, nervous. Despite the recent positive changes, years of precariousness had conditioned him to always expect the worst. Alexander took a deep breath before speaking. "Mark, there's something I need to tell you, something that will change our lives forever." Mark felt his heart racing. What could be so important? "A few days ago, when I was at your house, I noticed the necklace you wear," Alexander began. "That necklace has a history you need to know." Mark instinctively touched the necklace hanging from his neck. "It was my mother's," he said softly. "It's the only thing I have of her." Alexander nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Your mother's name was Sophie, right?" Mark looked at him surprised. "Yes, how do you know?" "Because I gave it to her," Alexander replied, his voice barely a whisper. "Sophie and I said we were together many years ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Mark looked at Alexander with a mixture of confusion and growing understanding. "What are you saying?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. Alexander stood up, unable to keep still. "Mark, a few days ago I discovered something that has changed everything I thought I knew about my life. Sophie, your mother, was pregnant when we separated. I didn't know. I left to study abroad and we lost touch. When I returned years later, she had already died," Mark completed, his voice barely audible. Alexander nodded, tears now freely running down his face. "Mark, what I'm trying to tell you is that I am your father." The world seemed to stop for Mark. Alexander's words echoed in his mind, challenging everything he thought he knew about his life, his identity, his place in the world. "No," said Mark, standing up abruptly. "It can't be. This is crazy." "I know it's hard to believe," said Alexander, taking a step towards Mark. "But I swear to you, it's the truth. I've spent the last few days investigating, talking to old friends. Everything fits, Mark. You are my son." Mark stepped back, his mind a whirlwind of emotions, anger, confusion, disbelief, and a hint of something he didn't want to admit. Hope. "And what do you expect me to do with this information?" Mark snapped. "Do you think this changes anything? That I'll suddenly forget years of struggle, of seeing my family suffer while you lived in your mansion?" Alexander lowered his head, guilt visible in every line of his face. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Mark. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed you to know the truth, and I want to try to be part of your life, if you'll allow me." Mark remained silent, processing everything he had just heard. His mind traveled to his childhood, to the stories his grandmother told him about his mother, to the nights when he wondered what it would be like to have a father. "I need time," Mark finally said. "This is too much." Alexander nodded, understanding. "Of course. Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready to talk." Mark headed towards the door, but before leaving, he stopped and turned to Alexander. "One more thing," he said, his voice laden with emotion. "My family, my children and my mother, they are my life. If this is true, if you really are my father, I need to know that they will be okay." "I promise you, Mark," Alexander responded fervently. "I will do everything in my power to ensure that your family has everything they need." Mark nodded briefly and left the office, leaving Alexander alone with his thoughts and the weight of years of involuntary absence. Meanwhile, in Mark's small apartment, Lucy and Michael played unaware of the drama unfolding. Mrs. Sarah, from her room, coughed softly, her thoughts with the son who worked so hard to keep the family afloat. None of them could imagine how their lives were about to change, how fate had woven a web of connections that now, finally, came to light. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions for Mark. Every morning he woke up, hoping it had all been a dream, only to be hit again by the reality of the situation. His boss, the man he had always seen as a symbol of everything that was out of his reach, was actually his biological father. At work, Mark felt the curious glances of his colleagues. The changes at TechVision had been quick and drastic, and everyone wondered what role Mark played in all of this. Rumors ran like wildfire, but no one dared to ask directly. For his part, Alexander immersed himself in work with renewed energy. He implemented wellness programs, reviewed all company policies, and even initiated a foundation to help low-income families. But every decision, every action, was tinged by the weight of his recent discovery. One afternoon, as Mark was cleaning one of the executive floors, he came face to face with Alexander. The moment was awkward, loaded with unspoken words and contained emotions. "Mark," Alexander began, his voice soft. "How are you?" Mark visibly tensed. "I'm working, sir." Alexander winced at the formality. "Mark, please, you don't have to call me sir. Well, you know." "With all due respect," Mark replied, his voice controlled. "I'm still processing all of this. I can't just forget years of everything." Alexander nodded, understanding. "I understand. I just want you to know that I'm here. When you're ready to talk." Mark nodded briefly and continued with his work, leaving Alexander with a mixture of frustration and sadness. That night, at home, Mark could no longer contain the weight of the truth. He sat his mother and children in the small living room and Yachas, with a trembling voice, told them everything. Mrs. Sarah listened in silence, tears rolling down her cheeks. When Mark finished, she slowly stood up and hugged him tightly. "My boy," she whispered. "Your mother would be so proud of you. You've been strong for so long." Lucy, with the wisdom that only a child can have, asked, "Dad, does this mean we'll be rich now?" Mark couldn't help but laugh, despite the tears in his eyes. "It's not that simple, sweetheart. Money isn't everything. But it could help with Grandma's medicines," added Michael, surprising everyone with his insight. Mark looked at his family, feeling a mixture of love, pride, and fear. How would this change their lives? Were they prepared for what was to come? Meanwhile, in his mansion, Alexander spent another sleepless night. He looked at old photos of Sophie, trying to imagine what his life would have been like if he had known the truth so many years ago. Remorse consumed him, but he also felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to be the father Mark deserved. The next morning, Alexander made a decision. He couldn't change the past, but he could try to build a better future. With determination, he began making calls and pulling strings. If Mark wasn't ready to accept him as a father, perhaps he could demonstrate his sincerity through actions. In the following days, mysterious changes began to occur in Mark's life. A renowned specialist arrived to treat Mrs. Sarah, offering his services for free. Lucy and Michael received full scholarships to one of the best schools in the city. Even the old building where they lived began to be renovated, with improvements that benefited all residents. Mark observed these changes with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. He knew Alexander was behind all of this, and part of him wanted to reject it all, but seeing the smile on his mother's face, hearing the excitement in his children's voices, it was hard not to feel grateful. One night, as Mark was walking through the park near his house, he ran into Alexander. It wasn't a coincidence. Alexander had been waiting, hoping for the right moment to talk. "Mark," Alexander said softly, "I know I can't change the past, but I want you to know that I'm committed to being part of your life, of your children's lives, if you'll allow me." Mark remained silent for a long moment, looking at the horizon. Finally, he spoke. "It won't be easy. There's a lot of pain, a lot of history between us." "I know," Alexander replied, "but I'm willing to try if you are." Mark touched the necklace on his neck, thinking of his mother, of the stories he never got to hear from her lips. He thought of his children, of the future they could have, and he thought of himself, of the boy who always wondered why he didn't have a father. "Maybe," Mark finally said, "we could start with a dinner, you, me, and my family." Alexander's smile lit up his face. "I'd love that, Mark, more than you can imagine." As the two men walked together through the park, tentatively talking about future plans, Mark's necklace sparkled under the moonlight. It was a symbol of a shared past, of lost and found love, and of the promise of a new beginning. The story of Alexander and Mark was just beginning, full of challenges and possibilities. But for the first time in a long time, both felt something they had lost long ago: hope. The dinner Mark had proposed became an event loaded with expectations and nervousness for everyone involved. Alexander, accustomed to handling board meetings and multi-million-dollar negotiations, found himself surprisingly anxious at the prospect of sharing a meal with his newly discovered son's family. Mark, for his part, was torn between curiosity and wariness. Part of him yearned to know more about his biological father, about the love story that had led to his existence. Another part feared that this new bond could somehow threaten the life he had built with so much effort. The night of the dinner arrived, and Mark's small apartment buzzed with activity. Mrs. Sarah, feeling better thanks to the new treatments, insisted on cooking herself, filling the house with aromas of her famous stew. Lucy and Michael ran back and forth, half excited, half nervous at the prospect of meeting their newly discovered grandfather. When the doorbell rang, an expectant silence fell over the house. Mark opened the door to find Alexander there, dressed casually but elegantly, holding a bouquet of flowers and a bag of gifts. "Good evening," said Alexander, his voice betraying a slight tremor. "I hope I haven't arrived too early." Mark shook his head, inviting him in. "You're right on time. Come in. Please." As he entered the living room, Alexander immediately found himself surrounded by the warmth and organized chaos of a real family. Mrs. Sarah came out of the kitchen, drying her hands on her apron. "Mr. Morgan," she said, her voice mixing respect and a hint of maternal challenge. "Welcome to our home." Alexander approached her, offering her the flowers. "Please, call me Alexander, and thank you for welcoming me into your home." Lucy and Michael, who until that moment had been hiding behind the sofa, approached shyly. Alexander crouched down to be at their level, smiling softly. "Hello," he said, his voice full of contained emotion. "You must be Lucy and Michael. It's a pleasure to meet you." Lucy, always the bravest, stepped forward. "Is it true that you're our grandfather?" Alexander nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "That's right, although it's new for me too. I hope we can get to know each other better." Michael, still shy, moved a little closer. "Do you really have a mansion, with a pool and everything?" Mark was about to scold Michael for his direct question, but Alexander let out a genuine laugh. "Yes, I have a big house with a pool. Maybe someday you can visit it, if your parents agree." The dinner progressed in an atmosphere of initial caution that gradually gave way to tentative warmth. Mrs. Sarah, initially wary, found herself sharing anecdotes from Mark's childhood, while Alexander listened attentively to every word, trying to reconstruct in his mind the lost years. As the night progressed, the conversations became deeper. Mark, encouraged by the relaxed atmosphere, dared to ask the question that had been on his mind. "Alexander," he began, his voice soft but firm, "could you tell me more about my mother? About how you met? What she was like?" An expectant silence fell over the table. Alexander took a sip of water, preparing to respond. "Sophie was extraordinary," he began, his voice laden with emotion. "We met in our senior year of high school. I was the typical rich kid, arrogant, believing the world revolved around me. She taught me to see beyond my bubble." As Alexander spoke, painting with his words the image of a young Sophie full of life and compassion, Mark felt that a part of himself, a part that had always been incomplete, began to fill. "She had this gift," Alexander continued. "She could see the best in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves. It was she who inspired me to want to use technology to make the world a better place, although it took me years to remember that lesson. Mrs. Sarah, who had been listening attentively, intervened. Sophie always spoke of you with affection, even after you left. She never wanted Mark to grow up with resentment. These words hit Alexander hard. I didn't deserve her kindness. If only I had known. Mark, seeing the pain in Alexander's eyes, felt something soften inside him. We can't change the past, he said softly, but maybe we can build something new from here. The evening continued, with shared stories, tentative laughter, and, little by little, the formation of new bonds. When it came time for Alexander to leave, the atmosphere was notably different from the beginning of the night. At the door, Alexander paused and looked at Mark. "Thank you," he said simply, "for giving me this opportunity." Mark nodded, a small smile on his lips. "It's a start." As Alexander walked away, Mark stood at the door, watching him. The necklace around his neck seemed to weigh a little less, as if part of the burden he carried had been lightened. Inside, Lucy and Michael bombarded Mrs. Sarah with questions about their new extended family, while she tried to answer with patience and wisdom. In the days and weeks that followed, small changes began to manifest. Alexander, true to his word, continued his efforts to improve the living conditions, not only of Mark's family but of all Tech Vision employees. He implemented continuing education programs, improved benefit packages, and established an emergency fund for employees in difficult situations. Mark, for his part, began to slowly open up to the idea of having Alexander in his life. He accepted Alexander's offer to pay for night classes so he could complete his education, a dream he had abandoned long ago due to circumstances. However, not everything was perfect. There were moments of tension, misunderstandings, and old resentments that occasionally surfaced. The gap between their worlds, although closing Cries, was still significant. One day, as Mark was studying in the Tech Vision library, a new benefit for employees, he ran into Patricia, Alexander's personal assistant. She looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and something that seemed almost resentment. "So you're the famous Mark," she said, her tone seemingly kind but with a hidden edge. "The lost son of the great Alexander Morgan." Mark tensed, unsure how to respond. Yes, I suppose so." Patricia leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "I just hope you know how lucky you are. Some of us have worked our entire lives to get where we are, and you simply appear." Before Mark could respond, Patricia walked away, leaving him with a feeling of unease. It was a reminder that, despite the progress, there was still a long way to go. That night, as he had dinner with his family, Mark remained unusually quiet. Lucy, perceptive as always, noticed his mood. "Is something wrong, Dad?" she asked, her big eyes full of concern. Mark looked at his daughter, then at Michael and his mother. These were the people he had fought for all his life. How could he explain to them the complicated emotions he was experiencing? "Sometimes," he began slowly, "when things change very quickly, it can be hard to know exactly how to feel." Mrs. Sarah nodded understandingly. "Change always brings challenges, son. But also opportunities." Mark smiled weakly. "You're right, Mom. It's just that sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing by letting Alexander into our lives." "But Dad," Michael interjected, "Grandpa Alexander is great. He took us to the zoo the other day and bought us huge ice creams." Mark couldn't help but laugh. "Yes, that's true. He has been very generous. And more importantly," added Mrs. Sarah, "he's trying to make amends for his mistakes. That takes courage." Mark nodded, thoughtful. He knew his mother was right. Despite the obstacles and occasional disapproving looks from some at Tech Vision, Alexander was making a genuine effort. "I guess we're all learning," Mark finally said. "And maybe that's what's important, that we're trying." As the family continued their dinner, discussing their days and making plans for the future, Mark realized that, despite the complications, his life had been enriched in ways he never could have imagined. The road ahead might be difficult, but at least he no longer walked it alone. And so, with each passing day, the Rodriguez family and Alexander Morgan continued to build bridges over the turbulent waters of their shared past, moving little by little towards a future that, although uncertain, was full of possibilities. As the weeks passed, the relationship between Mark and Alexander continued to evolve. Though not without its ups and downs, Mark found himself divided between gratitude for the opportunities Alexander was providing his family and resentment for the years of absence and hardship. One afternoon, as Mark was working in the Tech Vision maintenance office, he received an unexpected call. It was Patricia Chi, Alexander's assistant. "Mark," she said, her voice tense, "Mr. Morgan wants to see you in his office." Now, intrigued and a little worried, Mark headed to the executive floor. As he entered Alexander's office, he found himself in a tense scene. Alexander was standing by the window, his posture rigid, while Patricia looked at him with a mixture of triumph and anxiety. "What's going on?" asked Mark, feeling like he had walked into the middle of a storm. Alexander turned, his face a mask of contained emotions. "Mark, please sit down. There's something we need to discuss." Mark sat down, his heart pounding. Had he done something wrong? Had Alexander regretted recognizing him as his son? "Patricia has brought certain information to my attention," Alexander began, his voice controlled. "Information about your past." Mark felt his blood run cold. What could Patricia have discovered? "Apparently," Alexander continued, "a few years ago you were involved in an incident at your previous job, something related to missing money." The memory hit Mark like lightning. He remembered those dark days, when his mother was seriously ill and they had no money for her medications. He had made a desperate decision, one he had deeply regretted ever since. Mark began, his voice trembling. "I can explain." Patricia intervened, her voice laden with accusation. "Explain what? That you're a thief? That you've been deceiving Mr. Morgan all this time?" "Enough, Patricia!" exclaimed Alexander, surprising both of them. He turned to Mark, his voice softer. "Mark, I want to hear your version. Please, tell me what happened." Mark took a deep breath, gathering courage. "It was 5 years ago. My mother was very sick. We desperately needed money for her medications. I took money from the petty cash at my old job. I fully intended to return it, but you got caught," Alexander completed. Mark nodded, ashamed. "I lost my job. I had to do community service and pay a fine. Since then, I've been trying to make amends for that mistake, to be a better man for my family." The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia looked triumphant, clearly expecting Alexander to fire Mark on the spot, but Alexander's reaction surprised them both. "Mark," he said softly, "thank you for being honest with me. I know what it's like to make desperate decisions when you feel you have no other choice." He turned to Patricia, his voice taking on a tone of authority. "Patricia, I appreciate your diligence, but in the future I ask that you bring this type of information directly to me in private. You may go." Patricia left the office, clearly disconcerted by the turn of events. Once alone, Alexander sat next to Mark. "Son," he said, the words still sounding strange but sincere, "we all make mistakes. What's important is how we choose to learn and grow from them." Mark felt as if an enormous weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Thank you for understanding. I've been trying to leave that mistake behind, to be the man my family deserves." Alexander smiled softly. "And you are, Mark. I see how hard you work, how you care for your family. That says much more about your character than a mistake made in a moment of desperation." Mark felt tears threatening to spill. For the first time, he truly felt that Alexander saw him, not just as an employee or even as a newly discovered son, but as a complex man with his own history and struggles. "There's something else I want to discuss with you," Alexander continued. "I've been thinking about implementing a mentoring program at Tech Vision. Experienced employees guiding younger ones or those who want to advance in their careers. I'd like you to be part of this program. Mark, your experience, your perspective, they could be invaluable to others." Mark was stunned. "Me? But I'm just a maintenance employee." Alexander shook his head. You're much more than that, Mark. You've navigated difficulties that many of our employees can't even imagine. Your resilience, your work ethic, that's what I want you to share with others. For the first time since he had discovered the truth about his father, Mark felt a real connection with Alexander. It wasn't just the blood tie, but a mutual understanding, a respect that went beyond titles and positions. I would be honored to be part of that program, Mark finally said. Alexander smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his face. Excellent. We'll work on the details together. As he left Alexander's office, Mark felt different. The shame of his past, though still present, no longer seemed an unbearable burden. In its place, he felt a new determination, a renewed purpose. That night, at home, Mark shared what had happened with his family. Mrs. Sarah hugged him tightly, proud of her son's honesty and growth. Lucy and Michael, though not fully understanding the situation, felt the importance of the moment. Thanks, does this mean you'll work in a fancy office like Grandpa Alexander now? Michael asked excitedly. Mark laughed softly. Not exactly, Michael, but it means I'll have the opportunity to help other people in the company, to share what I've learned. Lucy, always perceptive, looked at her father with bright eyes. I'm proud of you, Dad. You've always taught us to be honest and work hard, even when things are difficult. His daughter's words deeply touched Mark. He realized that, despite all the challenges they had faced, he had managed to pass on important values to his children. Thank you, my love, he said, hugging Lucy. We're all learning and growing together. The following months were a period of transformation for Mark and his family. The mentoring program at TechVision took off successfully, and Mark found himself sharing his experience and knowledge with employees from various departments. His unique perspective, combining the experience of working from the ground up to his new position, proved invaluable to many. Alexander Hugh, for his part, continued implementing changes at TechVision. Inspired largely by Mark's ideas and suggestions, the company began to be recognized not only for its technological innovations, but also for its progressive labor practices and commitment to social responsibility. However, not everything was rosy. As Mark rose in the company and his relationship with Alexander strengthened, he began to face resistance from some high-level executives who saw his ascent as a threat. One afternoon, after a particularly tense meeting where Mark had proposed a new training program for low-income employees, he found himself face-to-face with Victor Salazar, the Vice President of Operations. Mark, said Victor, his voice laden with condescension, I understand that you feel empowered by your new position, but you must remember that there are people here who have dedicated decades to this company. You can't just come in and expect to change everything overnight. Mark felt his blood boiling, but he maintained his composure. Mr. Salazar, with all due respect, my proposals are based on my experience and what I've learned from other employees. I believe they can benefit TechVision in the long term. Victor moved closer, lowering his voice. Listen, kid, we all know why you're here. Being Alexander's lost son may have given you a fast pass, but don't be confused. This is a business, not a charity. Before Mark could respond, Alexander's voice resonated in the hallway. Is there a problem here, gentlemen? Victor stepped back, his attitude changing instantly. Not at all, Alexander. I was just congratulating Mark on his latest proposal. Alexander looked at both men, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. I'm glad to hear it. Mark, could you come with me to my office? There's something I want to discuss with you. Once in the privacy of Alexander's office, Mark could no longer contain his frustration. How can I do my job if half the board sees me as an intruder? Alexander sighed, rubbing his temples. I'm sorry, Mark. I should have foreseen that this might happen. Some of the old guard feel threatened by change. I don't want to cause problems, said Mark. Maybe it was a mistake to accept this position. Alexander stood up, putting a hand on Mark's shoulder. No, son, it wasn't a mistake. Your ideas, your perspective, are exactly what TechVision needs. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Mark looked at Alexander, feeling a mixture of gratitude and determination. Thank you, Dad. It was the first time Mark had called Alexander Dad, and the moment didn't go unnoticed by either of them. Alexander felt a lump forming in his throat. "Mark," he said softly, "I know I can't make up for the lost years, but I want you to know that I'm incredibly proud of the man you've become, and I promise that we'll face these challenges together." That night, during the family dinner, Mark shared the day's events with his family. Mrs. Sarah listened attentively, her face a mixture of concern and pride. "Son," she finally said, "always remember where you come from. Your strength isn't in your new title or your relationship with Alexander. It's in your heart, in your experience, in your desire to help others." Lucy, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. "Dad, remember when you taught me to ride a bike? I fell many times, but you told me that the important thing was to get up and keep trying." Mark smiled, and remembering that day. "That's right, my love." "Well," Lucy continued, "I think it's the same now. Maybe you'll fall sometimes in your new job, but the important thing is that you keep trying, because what you're doing is important." His daughter's words deeply touched Mark. He realized that, in his desire to prove his worth at TechVision, he had almost forgotten the most important lessons he himself had taught his children. "You're right," said Mark, looking at his family with love and gratitude. "I can't control what others think of me, but I can continue to be true to who I am and what I believe in." As the family continued their dinner, discussing their days and making plans for the future, Mark felt renewed. The challenges at TechVision were real, but so was the support of his family and the opportunity to make a real difference. In his office, Alexander reviewed the day's reports, but his mind was on the conversation with Mark. He took out an old photo of Sophie and looked at it with a mixture of nostalgia and determination. "We're doing well, aren't we, Sophie?" he murmured. "Our son is an extraordinary man. I promise I'll do everything I can to support and protect him." Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Victor Salazar met secretly with other disgruntled executives. "We need to do something," he said quietly. "Mark Rodriguez and his progressive ideas are changing too much, too fast. It's time to take action." The following days promised to be a battlefield of ideals, loyalties, and the true meaning of business success. Mark, Alexander, and the entire Rodriguez family would face challenges that would test not only their newly formed relationship, but also their deepest values. The tension at TechVision reached its peak a few weeks later. Mark had been working tirelessly on a new project, a scholarship and internship program for young people from marginalized neighborhoods, designed to provide them with opportunities in the technology world. It was a project close to his heart, one that he felt could make a real difference. The day of the final presentation to the board of directors arrived. Mark, nervous but determined, presented his proposal with passion and detail. Alexander watched with evident pride, while Victor Salazar and his allies exchanged skeptical glances. "It's an ambitious project, Mr. Rodriguez," said one of the directors when Mark finished. "But have you considered the costs? And how can we be sure that these young people will be up to TechVision's standards?" Mark was prepared for this question. "The initial costs may seem high, but in the long term, this program will provide us with a diverse and talented pool of new employees. As for the standards, I myself am living proof of what someone can achieve when given an opportunity." Victor Salazar leaned forward, his voice laden with condescension. "Mark, we appreciate your enthusiasm, but TechVision is a top-tier technology company, not a charity organization. Perhaps you should consider starting a separate foundation for these personal projects." Mark felt his blood boiling, but before he could respond, Alexander intervened. "Victor," he said, his voice calm but firm, "TechVision's purpose has always been to innovate and improve lives. Mark's project fits perfectly with that mission. Moreover, other tech companies are already implementing similar programs with great success." The discussion heated up, with the board divided between those who supported Mark and Alexander's vision and those who resisted change. Finally, it was decided to postpone the decision for a future meeting. As they left the boardroom, Mark felt discouraged. Alexander caught up with him in the hallway. "Don't be discouraged, son," he said softly. You've planted an important seed today. Sometimes change takes time. Mark nodded, grateful for the support. Thanks, Dad. I just hope I'm not causing more problems than solutions. On the contrary, Alexander replied, you're challenging the status quo, and that always makes some people uncomfortable, but it's necessary for progress. That night, as Mark was sharing the day's events with his family, the doorbell rang. To everyone's surprise, it was Alexander. I hope I'm not interrupting, he said, a bit uncomfortable. I felt I needed to talk to all of you. Mrs. Sarah invited him in, and soon the whole family was gathered in the small living room. Alexander looked at each of them before speaking. I want you to know that I'm fully committed to Mark's project, he began. But more than that, I'm committed to this family. It's been months since I discovered the truth about Mark, and every day I realize how fortunate I am to have this second chance. Lucy, always direct, asked her, does that mean you're going to come to dinner more often, Grandpa? Alexander laughed, feeling some of the tension dissipate. I'd love to, if you'll have me. As the night progressed, the conversation flowed more easily. Mark watched as Alexander interacted with his children, answering their questions about technology and sharing stories from his youth. For the first time, it really felt like a united family. However, the peace of the family night was interrupted by an urgent phone call. It was Patricia, Alexander's assistant. Mr. Morgan, she said, her voice tense. There's been a leak. Someone has sent details about Mark's past to the press and is insinuating that his position at TechVision is only due to nepotism. The world seemed to stop for a moment. Mark and Alexander looked at each other, concern evident on their faces. Who could have done this? Asked Mark, though deep down, he had a suspicion. Alexander sighed deeply. I don't know for sure, but I have an idea. Mark, we need to face this head on. We can't allow this to divide us or undermine everything we've achieved. Mark nodded, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. You're right. We can't hide from the truth. Mrs. Sarah, who had been listening attentively, intervened. Son, Alexander, remember that the truth always comes to light. What's important is how you choose to face it. Lucy and Michael, though not fully understanding the situation, approached their father and hugged him. We're with you, Dad, Lucy said softly. Alexander observed the scene with a mixture of pride and determination. We'll face this together as a family. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Newspaper headlines and newscasts talked about nothing but the scandal at TechVision. Tech mogul's illegitimate son, nepotism or redemption. The headlines read, Mark felt overwhelmed. Every time he left the house, he felt the stares and whispers of neighbors. At TechVision, some colleagues avoided him, while others offered words of support. Alexander, for his part, faced the board of directors and shareholders, many of whom demanded explanations and immediate action. It was in the midst of this chaos that Alexander made a bold decision. He called a press conference, but with one condition: Mark would be by his side. The day of the conference arrived. The room was full of journalists and cameras. Mark, dressed in a suit Alexander had given him, felt out of place but determined. Alexander approached the podium with Mark by his side. He took a deep breath before beginning. Good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate your presence here today. In recent days, many stories and rumors have circulated about my relationship with Mark Rodriguez and his position at TechVision. We're here today to tell the truth, the whole truth. Alexander proceeded to relate the complete story, his relationship with Sophie, how they lost touch, the discovery that Mark was his son, and how this had led him to reevaluate not only his personal life, but also the direction of TechVision. Yes, I made mistakes in the past, Alexander continued, mistakes that caused suffering to people who didn't deserve it, but I'm here today not to ask for forgiveness, but to demonstrate how we're turning those mistakes into something positive. Then, to everyone's surprise, Alexander handed the microphone to Mark. Mark, nervous but determined, began to speak. My name is Mark Rodriguez. Until a few months ago, I was a maintenance employee at TechVision, struggling to support my family. Yes, I made a mistake in my past, a mistake born of desperation and love for my sick mother. But that mistake doesn't define me. What defines me are the lessons I've learned, the hard work I've done, and the desire to create a better world for my children and for all those who, like me, have faced difficulties. Mark continued talking about the programs he had proposed at TechVision, about how his life experience had given him a unique perspective on the needs of employees and the community. "I'm not here because of nepotism," Mark concluded. "I'm here because I believe in the power of second chances, in the importance of diversity of perspectives in the workplace, and in TechVision's potential to be not just a successful company, but also a force for good in our society." When Mark finished speaking, there was a moment of silence in the room. Then, to everyone's surprise, someone began to applaud. Soon, the entire room was filled with applause. Alexander, with tears in his eyes, hugged Mark in front of all the cameras. "I'm proud to call you my son," he said, loud enough for the microphones to catch it. Questions from journalists poured in, but Alexander and Mark handled them with honesty and grace. By the time the conference ended, the narrative had changed. It was no longer a story of scandal, but one of redemption, of second chances, and of a company that dared to think differently. In the days that followed, the public reaction was overwhelmingly positive. TechVision's stocks, which had initially fallen with the scandal, began to rise again. More importantly, other companies began to contact TechVision, interested in implementing programs similar to those proposed by Mark. However, not everything was resolved. Victor Salazar and his allies on the board of directors remained a thorn in Alexander and Mark's side. They knew that the battle for TechVision's soul was not yet over. One night, as Mark was having dinner with his family, he received an urgent phone call from Alexander. "Son," Alexander said, his voice laden with emotion, "I just received news that will change everything. I need you to come to my office early tomorrow morning. There's something you must see." Mark, intrigued and a little worried, agreed to meet Alexander first thing the next morning. As he hung up the phone, he couldn't help but wonder what new surprise fate had in store for him. That night, as everyone slept, Mark took out his mother's old necklace and held it in his hands. "Mom," he whispered, "I hope you're proud of me. I promise that, no matter what happens, I'll keep fighting to do the right thing." With that promise in his heart, Mark went to sleep, not knowing that the next day, a final revelation would change the course of his life and the future of TechVision forever. Morning arrived with a mix of anticipation and nervousness for Mark. He said goodbye to his family with an extra tight hug, feeling he was on the brink of something important. Upon arriving at Alexander's office, he found his biological father sitting behind his desk with an indescribable expression on his face. On the desk was an old, familiar-looking box. "Mark," Alexander began, his voice laden with emotion, "last night I received an unexpected visit. It was Sophie's sister, your aunt." Mark felt his heart racing. He barely remembered his aunt. She had distanced herself from the family shortly after Sophie's death. Alexander continued, "She brought me this box. It belonged to your mother and, well, I think you should see it for yourself." With trembling hands, Mark opened the box. Inside he found letters, photographs, and a diary. But what caught his attention most was a sealed envelope with his name written in his mother's elegant handwriting. "Read it," Alexander gently encouraged. Mark opened the envelope and began to read. "My dear Mark, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you. There are so many things I wish I could tell you, so many hugs I wish I could give you. But time is short, and there's something important you need to know. Your father, Alexander, doesn't know about your existence. I made the difficult decision not to tell him when he left to study abroad. I didn't want him to abandon his dreams for us. Perhaps it was a mistake, but it was a decision made out of love. But there's something else, something that could change everything. Before I met Alexander, I worked as an intern at the company that would eventually become TechVision. During my time there, I discovered something. The technology that catapulted the company to success was not created by the original founders. It was the work of a group of young interns, including myself. In this box, you'll find evidence, prototypes, notes, everything needed to prove the truth. I'm not seeking vengeance or posthumous recognition. My hope is that this information can be used to do good, to ensure that TechVision becomes the positive force I always dreamed it could be." Mark, my love, I trust you to do the right thing with this information. I know you've grown to be a good and just man. I'm proud of you, more than words can express. With all my love, Mom. Mark finished reading, tears freely running down his face. He looked at Alexander, who was also visibly moved. I had no idea, Alexander said softly. Sophie was always brilliant. But this... Mark nodded, processing the enormity of the revelation. What do we do now? Alexander stood up and walked to the window, looking at the city sprawling below. We do the right thing, he said finally. We honor Sophie's legacy. In the weeks that followed, Alexander and Mark worked tirelessly. With the help of lawyers and technology experts, they verified the authenticity of the information provided by Sophie. The truth was undeniable. TechVision had been built on the unrecognized work of brilliant young people. Armed with this information, Alexander called an emergency board meeting. The revelation caused shock, but Alexander wasn't interested in pointing fingers. Gentlemen, he said, his voice firm, we have a unique opportunity. We can use this information to transform TechVision into something truly revolutionary. Mark intervened. We propose creating a foundation in honor of my mother and all the young innovators whose names were forgotten. This foundation will be dedicated to supporting young talents from marginalized communities, giving them the opportunity to develop their ideas and be recognized for their work. The proposal faced initial resistance, especially from Victor Salazar and his allies, but the evidence was irrefutable, and the vision presented by Alexander and Mark was powerful. Finally, after hours of debate, the board voted in favor of the proposal. TechVision would embark on a new chapter, one of transparency, inclusion, and social responsibility. In the months that followed, TechVision's transformation made world news. The Sophie Rodriguez Foundation became a beacon of hope for young innovators around the world. Mark, now officially recognized as Alexander's son and appointed director of the foundation, worked tirelessly to make his mother's vision a reality. Alexander, for his part, found a new passion in his work. It was no longer just about profits and technology. It was about creating a positive legacy, about using the power of innovation to improve lives. A year after the revelation, the Rodriguez family gathered for a special dinner. Mrs. Sarah, now fully recovered thanks to the best medical treatments, watched with pride as her son and grandchildren interacted with Alexander. Sophie would be so proud, she said softly to Mark. Mark nodded, touching the necklace he now rarely took off. I know, Mom, sometimes I feel like she's here with us, guiding us. As the family shared laughs and memories, Mark reflected on the incredible journey his life had been. From a maintenance employee struggling to make ends meet, to the director of a foundation that was changing lives, from a son without a father to part of a united and loving family. The necklace around his neck, once a symbol of loss and secrets, now represented something more: the power of love, truth, and perseverance to overcome any obstacle. That night, as Mark prepared for bed, he looked out the window at the city lights. He thought of his mother, of Alexander, of his children, and of all the young people whose lives were being transformed by the Sophie Rodriguez Foundation. Thank you, Mom, he whispered to the starry sky. Your love and courage have brought us here. I promise your legacy will live on forever. And so, with his heart full of gratitude and hope for the future, Mark closed his eyes, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to make the world a better place.